Okay, so welcome to Keen on Yoga, another episode, and it's me today. I have been planning this episode for a while, and it's with slight trepidation. It's a cliffhanger there. That I want to tell you about my planned hip operation. Yes, it's a bilateral hip replacement indeed. And I think there's a lot to discuss in this podcast. I won't be drawing it out too long, but I hope you stay interested. And I plan to do another one with other people perhaps that have had one. So, where to start? Well, firstly, why I didn't go public until now. Well, that's kind of obvious. I'm a yoga teacher, and the obvious thread is this guy doesn't know what he's doing. He's done yoga in a certain way and he's ruined his body. And why would I want to learn from someone who has given themselves such an injury? So we can address that straight away. Well, by the very fact that you have pre-existing conditions to the body and that aggravated by malpractice. Right. And we'll come to that in a minute. So just in case you wondered whether I'm a terrible teacher, I'm not. And also the thing is, you learn from your mistakes, right? I certainly practiced, as many of us probably did, when learning the practice for over at least 10 years in a, let's say, less effective manner than I could. And to that end, certainly did myself no end of damage. But you learn, and that's the whole point of being a teacher. Another thing is, as I wrote a post on recently, this idea of Ashtanga gods, the idealization of the teacher. It's not good for business to sell realism, pragmatism, that we all get sick, that we all get injured. That, no, I'm not, if you didn't realize already, an Ashtanga god, or anywhere near that. That I have my own troubles like anyone else, and sharing them with other people is, one could say might not be good for business. But on the other hand, my business has always rested on my transparency, my honesty, my willingness to speak about all kinds of issues. So here I am still trying to be good for business. Not really. It's a side point. But I mean, I felt that with my kind of approach to things and my manifesto, let's say my personal manifesto towards this practice and towards teaching this practice, I couldn't keep quiet for too long about this issue. Although, of course, there was a sense of shame. There was a sense of uncertainty about how people would take it. There was a sense that it would seem to be immediately suggestive even that yoga or Ashtanga yoga was bad for you, that it caused hip replacements, which I certainly wouldn't put out there because it doesn't need to, doesn't have to. And we'll talk about that in a second. But recently teaching a 2-week retreat in Bali, a couple of people noticed, as it had been pointed out to me before as well, that I was limping, because the thing is, if I'm coming to do a workshop near you or a retreat near you, I can walk around fine, I'm not in any way unable to teach currently, right? The point is that I'm in pain. Not in practice really. I could always avoid that or work around that. Of course, I modified things. I don't stick my leg behind my head currently, and perhaps I never will again. And, to be honest, been there, done that, done all those postures, done up to the advanced B series. And even then, even when I was fully able, felt like, hey, no, I'm happy with that. Don't need to go further. Question of how much advanced asana do you really need to be satisfied? Anyway, where was I going from that? Modifying practice, yes, I'm doing that. The problem is just day-to-day activity, walking around a bit. I'm in pain, and people noticed, and I felt like, this is time to speak out now. And I was planning anyway. It wasn't like I was caught out. I was planning anyway to speak out, but just perhaps come sooner rather than later with a little nudge from people saying, are you okay? You appear to be limping. Yeah, I am. And at that point, of course, I was completely upfront and honest with the situation, having got my head around it for a number of years, to be honest. It has been a number of years that I've been in pain. And only, I suppose, a year ago when I started getting MRIs on the joint and gradually talking to different surgeons about possibilities. And of course they said, well, you're young. We don't need to do it yet. How much pain are you in? Can you walk around? And I suppose I could probably handle quite a lot of pain anyway. And I said, well, it's okay. I'm in pain, but not that bad. Like, are you sleeping? They say, are you sleeping or is the pain disrupting your sleep? And that's the one main, qualifier that they use. Is pain disrupting your sleep? And I said, no, I can sleep fine, not taking any painkillers or anything. Well, you can go on for a number of years then, they said. Yeah. Anyways, looking at the MRIs, having more MRIs, we decided on a hip replacement. The first is that these operations are becoming more common, not necessarily because more people are having them, but now because hip replacement surgery is so effective, so successful at dealing with the complaints, right? And minimally well, of course, it's invasive. You get your hip bone, you're sawn off at the top and replaced by a piece of metal or plastic, or ceramic, actually, but nevertheless, it's a successful, simple surgery, relatively speaking, if you're a surgeon. and that's why more people are having it. So to address the idea that, yoga is causing this, or that more people are having, and because there's been articles written on this kind of thing, more people are having hip replacements due to yoga is the common refrain. Well, probably not. Probably the technology has just become that much better that we're no longer waiting to get that replacement, because they do last now. They do last more than 10, 15 years, and you could have more than one of them when they wear out. Whereas originally there was a one-stop shop. You got one chance, they wore out, and then you couldn't get it redone because they were too difficult. So you were just bedridden then. So of course there was a waiting, but technology has moved on. You can get it done numerous times, and it's very successful. And the surgery itself has become much more, let's say, tissue sparing, basically, right? So you can go in from the front now. You don't have to go in from the back anymore. You can go in from the front without cutting muscles. So it's a simpler surgery as well, with less recovery time. So that's to answer one thing, but let's go on to the idea of, well, did yoga cause it, right? So this is the obvious corroboration of the situation. You were practicing advanced asana for years. These asanas aren't really relevant for an adult body, and you caused it, or you're practicing badly as well, and you caused yourself this complaint. Well, it's unlikely, let's say, to say the least. I mean, first of all, my own diagnosis is a necrosis of the bone, a death to the bone, right? A death because the blood supply that's feeding the bone is no longer doing so because of some earlier trauma to the area, that the blood supply has been cut off from the bone, and the bone gradually dies. So my surgeon often referred to it like you're tiling a bathroom, and the tiles you can put on top, they're fine. The top of my bone is okay, but underneath, the concrete is really faulty. Yeah, it's cracked, it's ruined. And so you can tile it as many times as you want, but if you're putting those tiles on a bone that's dead, that's going to crumble, then, you probably want to look at what you're putting those tiles on, right? So henceforth can't have a hip resurfacing, has to be a replacement of that bone. And of course, yoga didn't cause that itself, right? So we have to talk about pre-existing conditions here. As Stuart McGill of the back pain fame, if you have a tongue twister, says, let's get this right. Genetics loads the trigger, exposure pulls that trigger, and psychosocial situation or a milieu dictates the response, right? So what's happening around you dictates how you respond to it. Yeah, genetics basically loads the gun, and the exposure, what you do, pulls the trigger. So, of course, first of all, it's a matter of genetics. People are getting injured, then there's usually a pre-existent condition there, some abnormality, some kind of impingement. Basically, the joint isn't moving in the quote-unquote normal, regular way. There's some difficulty that it makes one prone, weak for an injury. And it's often the case. After you've got that after you have that impingement, right, so the joint is not moving, then you can further injure it. That's to talk of exposure. So first of all, the pre-existent condition that I have in the end is this, it's not a hip impingement, that's the joint not moving correctly. It has led to an impingement, but originally actually just deadness of the bone. And yeah, don't know how it happened. Probably there's a million and one ways where I could have put trauma on that hip. I always think about my skateboarding in the youth and how I was never really a skateboard culture kind of guy, but like when I was a kid and teenager, just doing all kinds of things, probably could have been anything. Anyways, don't remember it, and worked for a long time with yoga asana. Never hurt putting my leg behind my head, putting legs in lotus, anything like that, but could have. That's to talk of exposure. So for me, it's a strange one. Yeah. And it never hurt until it fairly suddenly really did. Yeah. So genetics, there's something there. And for me, it was this necrosis of the bone, avascular necrosis, they call it, no blood supply to the bone. But for other people, that hip impingement, that genetics that's loading the trigger could be to do with the shape of the bone. Right? It's often called a cam. The shape of the femur, if you can imagine the ball of the socket, is got a bit of a funny shape to it, to use a technical term, and it's not moving smoothly in the socket. Yep. And that causes an impingement, i.e. the movement is impinged, the movement is obstructed to the joint. So you've got the impingement first, or the impingement happens through the labrum. The cartilage around the hip socket is misshapen, let's say, is unusual. It's larger than usual. That's called a pincer. Yeah, so it's cam or pincer, the normal impingements, or you could have a shallowness of the hip socket as well, which also could cause an impingement, a lack of normal, regular movement around the joint. And again, no one's got normal movement, of course, but, roughly, let's say, in inverted commas, normal movement is impinged, right? So cam or pincer or dysplasia, the joint is shallow, or the joint could be even deep, right? If you look at a pelvis and you look at the shapes of the acetabulum is the hip joint. Yep. If you look at the shape of those joints, massive discrepancy. Joints are very shallow or joints are very deep, or the way it's set. The joint could be very low, right? It could be facing inwards. It could be facing outwards, right? So that's called retroversion or antiversion, right? If the joint's facing in or back, retro, or in, it's antiversion, right? So depends on where the joint is. That could cause an impingement of the movement. But again, secondly, it then depends on the exposure, what you do with that. Yeah. What you do with that particular condition, because we all have pre-existent conditions in the body, not that they ever need to affect us until they do. It depends on what we do with our bodies, of course. So that's to come on to the exposure pulls the trigger. Did yoga do it to me? Well, if you have a hip impingement, so the joint doesn't move regularly, ideally, let's say, then when you move it gradually, you will have basically wear and tear. So osteoarthritis, not rheumatoid. Rheumatoid is an immune condition where you get swollen. Yeah, you got swollen fingers and toes, first of all. Yeah. So very unfortunate. My nan had it and I have it a little bit on my hands. But that's not rheumatoid. I haven't got that. There's osteoarthritis. Basically, actually, it's a bit of a misnomer because there's no itis about it, no swelling, no inflammation about it. Osteoarthritis, simply wear and tear. Your wear and tear caused by basically the joint not moving smoothly. Joint doesn't move smooth and it gradually wears away at that cartilage that surrounds the joint. And that in the end causes bone on bone situation, which then causes pain response. Yeah. So impingement leads to osteoarthritis. What we could say yoga did it to me. Yeah. Where you could say, well, you did that and look at the joint now. It's all raggedy, etc., etc. Yeah. But it doesn't, you need the impingement, you need the genetics load to the gun to get exposure pulls the trigger. If you haven't got a loaded gun and you pull the trigger, nothing happens, obviously. So my loaded gun was this hip necrosis. Yep. Gradually moving on that, the dead bone. What happens to me is that if you can imagine direct pressure downwards on a head, right? So if you have direct pressure on one point, like weight bearing on your leg, it comes down to the bone, right? That pressure is a lot on the ball, yeah, if that bone is dead. Yeah. So to disperse that pressure, to take less pressure on the dead bone, right? What the body does in its wisdom is it tries to lay down lots of indents. Yep. So basically the hip now, my ball, the ball and socket is all indented, like flattened, not round, flattened to try and disperse the pressure. So when I stand, it doesn't go straight into the bone because the bone is weak. So that's what the body's done. So that basically misshapen bone caused by avascular necrosis gradually wears away at the cartilage. Yep. And that is the osteoarthritis coming in. So in the end, there is probably a cartilage problem as well. Although to be honest, I'm not sure. That's crazy. I mean, obviously you need to get more information if you have this situation, you need to get more information on your condition and the possibilities. I haven't even found out yet whether they're going to replace the ball and the socket and the ball, or just the ball. But I think you have to do both. Anyways, more talks with people, and yeah, a side point, any condition, obviously get the different opinions, because I had a few different opinions and they all say a little bit different things, surprise it or not. So worth gathering all the different information you can about it before you make your decision. That's the power you have. Okay. You're in a position of slight vulnerability, of course, but you can regain that power by learning. Yeah. And not just taking one person's opinion on it, because the first person I saw, I remember a year ago talking to someone, he got me to walk up and down and said, yep, you could get a hip replacement, not even really consulting any other factors. Yep, you could do it. And we'll go in from the back. Right. And I started research before that and realized going in from the back to the hip cuts all the tissues, right? You're cutting the piriformis, cutting a bit of the gluteus minimus, I think. And that's a bad thing, especially when you don't need to, when you can go in at the front now. Yeah. Of course, there are some reasons why sometimes they will still go in at the back, but that's more technical. We don't need to go in there. But yeah, so finding the information, because not all two surgeries are the same. Not all surgeons say the same thing, as much as they are very authoritative when you do speak to one, there's differences of opinion still. Yeah. Just like there is in yoga. So, okay. going back to the osteoarthritis and this thing, did the yoga do it to me? Exposure pulls the trigger. Well, yes, in Ashtanga, of course, the movements are extreme. There's no getting around it. The movements are complicated. Yeah, they're not just back and forth, left and right, like a gym movement. They're complicated, compound movements, and they're extreme movements, right? I think we've got rough angle of hip openness, let's say abduction being 40 degrees, between, I think, 40 and 60 degrees on an adult, slightly more on a female, I think, taking the hips wide. Yep, the Baddha Konasana movement. That's an average. And for lotus, I think, even though it's a slightly different position, you need about 110 degrees of rotation. So look, everyone knows that this system of yoga, and all yogas probably, well, therapeutic ones perhaps not, but, certainly Ashtanga, and I can speak for Ashtanga, involves in extreme movements which aren't anything near the regular levels of mobility and flexibility that people have. Having that in one's back pocket, understanding that we can still modify these to make them more comfortable for us. Albeit, yes, they were formulated around young Brahmin boys' bodies, as Krishnamacharya taught the system at the Mysore Palace and gave them yoga movement accordingly to their needs, right? There was no, I think we're starting to realize there was no divine text that was handed down to Krishnamacharya. He just simply was given a job, teach these young boys, and being a asana expert, taught them according to their needs at the time, 12 to 18-year-old boys. So again, I don't need to harp on this again because I've spoken enough about this elsewhere, but yes, of course, we need to realize these postures are extreme and they might need to be modified depending on our pre-existent conditions. Not only like a pathology, like problem condition, but just like how your body is, like not because of the way that your hip is fixed in the socket, for example, because it's also the shape of the bone will dictate how it moves, right? The shape of the ball on the socket, where the socket is, will dictate how your hip rotates. Yep. And even the torsion, the way the bone of the femur in the leg, that doesn't go straight down. That has a turn, that has a curve, a twist in it. And that will dictate how you move into lotus or into other rotational postures of the hip. Right? So everyone is different, and the degree of variety, if you look at the works of people like Bernie Clark, who I love and I'm doing a podcast with this week, or Paul Grilly, with Bernie's teacher, and they're in anatomical dissections of yoga, as it were. If you look at the amount of variability now that we're understanding exists between two individual bodies, it's massive. So of course, someone does a lotus easily. Other people, due to the compression at the shape of their bones, the bone hits bone very quickly, due to the shape of the joints and the bone, will never do lotus. And to push them into it is obviously going to cause a problem, right? So that's again a situation of genetics lowers the trigger. But what you do and how you do it, exposure, pulls that trigger. Yeah. And we have problems with the system, right? It was, after all, designed for a younger body than most of us, right? Being that you're not 12 to 18, probably. And how we do it, we're encouraged to practice the postures all the same now. Originally, Pattabhi Jois had a sheet on the wall of all the names of the postures. No diagrams, no idealization, only 12 students, so could teach them all differently. And Trikonasana was just a name, let's say. It wasn't an idealized shape. Oh, so-and-so, Shirat's poster on the wall, do it like that, I literally have heard that said, this is how we do Trikonasana, look at the picture on the wall. But that's one body doing it. Of course, we can draw from these, many of them very helpful videos and pictures, okay, that this is how to successfully rotate the body, right? The back hip should be tucked inwards rather than pulling it back, right? When we do Trikonasana, if we want to take the toe, we're going to have to drop that back hip. Yep. If we pull it back, it's going to really strain the lower back. So certain principles, but then adaptation, right? You may have to take the ankle. You may have to modify it in other ways. The stance, the length of the stance, the width of the stance, what the shoulders do. Yeah. And unfortunately, this is to talk about the last one, the psychosocial milieu dictates the results, right? So remember, exposure pulls that trigger, genetics loads the gun, and the results are dictated by the attitudes around us, the psychosocial milieu, as Stuart McGill's called it. And that still isn't great, to be honest. That still isn't really good. And the individuality isn't tolerated in Ashtanga still. People are squashed into postures, all the same, often not even asked. If they've got a pre-existing injury or something, just adjusted without even asked, it's a problem. Or even the practice is said to be healing. Oh, you've got a pain, right? Oh, well, keep practicing. It'll heal it. Yes, the practice can be healing, but it all depends on how you do it. It's not just healing. In fact, it can be very injurious, right? So yeah, our current attitudes might not be the most sensible either. Just practice. All is coming. Don't worry about it. It's mind over matter. All these things that maybe you've heard said. Yeah, I certainly did when I was practicing. Or even when we stop. Yeah, we stop a while. We don't question, oh, maybe there was something we were doing to cause this pain that I have had. This got so bad I've had to stop. We just wait. People just wait around and wait until they can start practicing again and do the exact same thing. You've got to change something. So exposure and the attitudes around us, I think they could be more healthy still. I don't think there's enough toleration for individual leeway. Certainly in the Mysore room, there isn't an understanding. Okay, that person will never do Marichasana C or D because of the shape of the joint, right? But let them go further. Of course, the joint isn't affected in Navasana or in some of the later postures or in second series postures. So they could do them. It's not just an exact linear progression, like jumping over increasingly large hurdles. Yeah. It doesn't work like that. The practice is a variety of postures, and due to the shape of the joints, some you may never do successfully, comfortably, safely, and others later on down the line will do very nicely, just due to the shape of your joints. This isn't understood, and still there's all this gatekeeping and stopping, silliness basically. Yep. And it never was originally taught that way. As I've said before, when Pattabhi Jois originally taught those first foreigners that rocked up at his doorstep, he taught them their versions of the primary and intermediate series in 3 months. Everyone got their version, with the ones they could do and the ones that they couldn't do left out, yeah, or modify. Or, as he often said, as Nancy Gilgoff said to me, she was held by Pattabhi Jois in all the postures she couldn't do, holding her there. You know, basically what I'm saying is that, yeah, this has increasingly become homogenized, the way that we taught, the way that we expect bodies to move. And I think that's to talk of the psychosocial milieu being not the most fortuitous, not the healthiest milieu, as it were. But of course, there's other aspects of the practice that, especially as we get older, we need to address. The practice isn't really that much to do with strength. It's to do with flexibility. The joints need strength. They need strength to keep them safe and stable. So we need the muscles around the joints to be strong, to keep the joints. Yeah. So as much as we like stretching, stretching a little goes a long way with stretching, really. Really, what you want to be working on is mobilization of the muscles, but keeping the joints firm. So strength-bearing stuff isn't available that much in the practice. And we might seek a little bit of outside mobility work, strength work to complement our yoga, right? I know it was a sacrilege before, but luckily, increasingly people are allowing us to do other things. And I think it'll be a good thing. Repetition without variation. I mean, that's not really helpful, is it? I think practice should be varied as well. We should be allowed to do different things, different days probably, or which is to say, perhaps when you're going to a Mysore room, of course, we're doing a collective practice for a number of reasons that I think are still good. So you have to stick to the program, right? Which is essentially why I say learn your version of the primary and second series. So at least you have two things to play with. But when you're at home, and some of the time I think we should always spend practicing at home alone, I think we should vary. I think we should allow more variation into our practices. Yeah. And originally, of course, those people that first went to Mysore, they went for a few months and the rest of the year they were practicing on their own. And having spoken to all these teachers, they never practiced like they did in Mysore. In other words, by the book. When they practiced at home, they always adapted. Yeah. So repetition is great, but variation is also essential for the body, right? And not training to one's peak every day, right? No athlete would train to their peak every day. Only on race days will you train to your peak. So being therapeutic in our approach, not pushing ourselves too hard, obviously, trying hard on one day of the week and resting on 4 days of the week, say, like varying the degree of training, right? To talk about, again, about the how we do it, right? So yeah, a lot in this podcast and hoping to do more on the subject, but safe to say that yoga is and can be healing, of course. Yeah, but it can also be painful and injurious if done in a certain way, which is not to respect the basic contours and genetics of one's own body. And I think you know when it's starting to hurt, really, if you dig deep down. I think I knew when I was starting to cause myself pain, and I persevered a little bit too long within this just because ego, really, and I probably did myself a little bit more damage than I needed to. But did yoga cause my injury or your injury? I would say not. I would say there's usually a pre-existent particular anomaly of that joint complex that leads to an easier potential of injury. Could be all kinds of things, as I've suggested, as well as the shape of the muscles, as well as the tension around the joint capsule or the tension around certain muscle groups. All kinds of things could be taken into account. You can't blame yoga for our injuries, right? It's also our approach, but also pre-existent propensities, proclivities, let's call them. But should everyone then know these pre-existent things? Like, should we all get MRIs before we start yoga? Someone suggested in a comment recently. No, I don't think that's helpful. Many existing proclivities never develop to be injuries, right? You could have an asymptomatic situation on your hands. And as Bernie says in his books, and I'm sure I'll say on the podcast, most things we have are asymptomatic. Most people have a tear in the meniscus by the time that they're 40. Most people have a situation with a vertebrae in their back by the time that they're 40. But these things never usually cause us trouble. Most things are asymptomatic. So just knowing about it, just having the MRI, sometimes a bit of a nocebo, can put fear into one's mind, unhelpfully perhaps. On the other hand, when things do start to hurt, yeah, of course, consult the experts, get yourself checked out, and find your options. Yeah. And don't be ashamed. I think also, obviously in my position, there was shame around it, and there was for a short while, yeah, albeit some not 100% transparency. I didn't mention it, and I could have mentioned it, I suppose. But, well, here we are now, and I hope to do more around this, as I said, again soon, and potentially vary the dialogue, looking and talking to different people who've had injuries, hip replacements. Perhaps we'll focus on first of all. So if you have, and if you want to talk, then maybe we could do a fun compendium on comparing our stories soon. And of course, during the time of recovery after the operation, I'll talk to you about that again then. And hopefully it all goes well. So thanks for listening. Back next week with a regular podcast, i.e. a normal one, talking to a guest. And as I said, it'll be Bernie Clark talking about, does yoga cure or injure, and all things along anatomical lines such as those. Anyway, hope you're having a great week, and I'll see you again next week. Bye for now.